I'm Thomas Cueni. Since February 1, I'm the new Director General of IFPMA, your hosts of today, and I'm very pleased and honored to welcome you here at the Vieux-Bois, and I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our moderator, Sukaina Virji. She will introduce all the speakers afterwards. I just want to say a few words of welcome. And actually, of course, I got a speech prepared, and the speech prepared is as dry and serious as the topic on shortages and the importance of actually overcoming and addressing the shortages issue. Therefore, I do feel obliged to crack a joke first. Politically slightly incorrect, but hopefully not too much. Because as in my former position in Interpharma, I quite often was confronted with the issue of shortages, having to respond to journalists who normally were called upon by pharmacists, and the pharmacists always complained the shortages is the industry to blame. That's what you usually would expect. That's why my jokes is now on the pharmacists. Many years ago, I read a book which is actually still worth reading. It's called Et la Confidentielle. But it was not about Los Angeles. It was about the other Ella, who at that time was still considered as the best biker and a fair sportsman of the world. And the book was about how actually did they become as successful as they were with the US postal team. They actually had copied and pasted, apparently, the Spaniards, because the Spaniards simply were faster than they did. And they asked the Spaniards, why are you so fast? And the Spaniards said, on a programme médical. Therefore, they asked what the programme médical is. And, you know, one part of the world, best cyclists normally prepare the spring training in the area of Girona, Catalonia. And the other part does it in northern Italy, around Lake Como. Now, where did you get your programme médical around Lake Como? Across the border in Switzerland, which is quite surprising, actually. This was the unexpected for me, because I was known that pharmaceutical prices in Switzerland tend to be rather higher than in Italy. Now, why did they go? And normally, actually, it was the personal trainer who went across the border for two reasons. Because in Switzerland, in the Ticino, totally different in le canton de Genève, et la République de Genève ou Vaud, Ticino, the pharmacist never asked for prescription. And, you know, erythropoietin is prescription only normally. And quite often the pharmacists didn't have it because it is expensive, and therefore they kept their stock low. Therefore, if they didn't have it, shortage, you could go back in the afternoon, and they by then had it because there's a very efficient wholesaling system in this country. Now, today we will not talk about this, and I have discussed this with my friend Ignacio Cassis once, whom some of you may know as actually one of the leading Swiss politicians and former cantonal doctor of the canton of Ticino. His very dry response, Thomas, I've no doubt it's true. Or it was true at that time. I'm not sure whether that sport is clean today. Now, today we are talking about something much more serious. In terms of vaccination, the topic of yesterday, immunization, the problem is actually different depending on country. The problem in Switzerland is we are still far too much influenced by the likes of Dr. Wakefield. We have one of the worst rates in terms of measles immunization, and therefore it's not an issue of shortages, it's simply an issue of hypocrisy. And there are children dying because parents don't believe in science, and parents don't believe in good vaccination program. But we also, even in a country such as Switzerland, we are faced with the issues of shortages once in a while. And we have been confronted with stock out of pediatric vaccines. We have been confronted in a number of also industrialized countries with stock out of chemotherapy products. And when this happens, it is a huge, potentially huge problem for the doctors, for the patients, for the hospitals, for the pharmacists. But it's also a huge problem for the industry, because basically you expect an industry which is so high-powered, dominated by big pharma companies, where you expect that everything runs smoothly. Problem with quality shouldn't happen. Problem with stock out, but they should know. Actually, when we had the issue about the bird flu or swine flu, you know, everybody wanted to get the vaccines. Then when everybody had the vaccines, it turned out that the pandemic was actually much less dangerous than expected. Therefore, everybody expected the industry take back the stuff they had just bought and give the money back. That was another problem. But today we really want to talk about from shortages to sustainable supply. Because be it WHO, be it the pharmacists, be it UNICEF, be it the industry, we all have a shared objective. It is to make sure that our medicines and vaccines reach the patients not just in the developed countries, but also in developing countries on time and for appropriate use. Now, I want to leave the floor now to our moderator, to our speakers. I'm very grateful that so many of you have come. I look forward to the presentations. I look forward to the debate, and thank you for having come here.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. As Thomas said, my name is Sukaina. I'm a journalist from London. I write for Scrip, which provides business insights for the pharmaceutical sector. Thank you to the IFPMA for inviting me. This is such an important topic. When I've mentioned to friends and family that I'm coming to Geneva to moderate a panel on global vaccine shortages, everybody seems a bit surprised. Global vaccine shortages? Surely this is a developing world problem. And I've had to explain, actually, it's not. This is a topic that potentially can impact every one of us. So we're going to start by asking Anders. Anders is the Chief Quality Officer, is that right, at Sanofi Pasteur. He's going to give us a brief introduction to this area, and then after that we will meet the rest of our panelists and continue with the session. So I'll give the floor to Anders first.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So we have put together a few slides to introduce the topic before we get into the additional comments and the Q&A. So we call it From Shortages to Sustainable Supply, and I think the first thing to say is that it's acknowledged pretty much everywhere around the world that we do have a problem with shortages of medicines, including vaccines also. It's time for us to think about what are the solutions, what is it we want to achieve to get to less shortages. So if we can take the next one, thanks. So what is a shortage? Well, even the definition we're not agreeing on across the world what the definition of a shortage is. But here's one saying that if we do not have our medicines at the right quantities, right time, right place, and right conditions, that can create a stock out to the person who actually needs this medicine or the vaccine. It's a topic that, as we just heard, this is not about developing countries only, or one country or another country. This is global. And I'm sure that Luc will share with us what pharmacists experience in terms of shortages. It's not something that happens once a year. It happens very often. It's everywhere around the world. So therefore, we need to think about it in a bigger perspective. Now, it's also not only for certain products. It's a lot of different products that we can end up with shortages. So let's have a look at what's the consequence of it. And as you can see here on this slide, you can have patients in the middle of a treatment and all of a sudden they cannot get the medicine that they're supposed to have. And you should expect that every patient should expect that whatever treatment they have, that the medicine should always be available. One is to get it in the beginning, but being in the mid of a treatment and not being able to continue the treatment simply because of a shortage is not a good situation to be in. In some cases, you can find an alternative, similar products comparison, or you can actually end up in a situation that you failure to treat a disease. And then in terms of immunization, I'm going to come back a little bit more to that. So in terms of immunization, so that's the area that I work in the vaccines for Sanofi Pasteur. More than 2.5 million people's lives are saved every year. So that's a fantastic achievement. The problem is that according to the statistics here, that even 2 years ago, 1 in 5 children, so 20%, did not get the full treatment they should. And also here, it's not about developing countries only. So the kids that should get the vaccines are not necessarily getting the full vaccination schedule, or maybe not even any vaccination. So that's a big problem. Every dollar spent, the society saves $44. So this is a good investment, obviously. We are used to now, in most of the world, that many of these diseases that are up here are not that common, because we're in a situation where most of the population in the world over years have been vaccinated. Smallpox is not happening anywhere anymore, it's eradicated. Polio, there's 2 countries left in the world, and then polio is eradicated as well. This is a fantastic achievement. We don't want to reverse and come back to situations where we have more diseases that could be totally prevented. So what are the causes here? This is a quite busy slide. So there are 2 things. One is on the demand side, and one is on the manufacturing or supply side. Now, if we look at the demand side, some of the things that can cause the shortages, all of a sudden there's an increase. A government, an organization says, okay, we need more of this medicine. It's like, oh, well, it was not produced that much. So there can be a sudden change in the demand. It could be that there were expectations to the development of a national program, and all of a sudden it's expedited, and then we need more supply as well. There can be an outbreak, particularly for vaccines. You have an outbreak of a disease, and all of a sudden you didn't expect that. Now you need to have all this ready. And I'll come back to the specificities about vaccines, why that's particularly for vaccines a challenge. Then in some cases, there's some internal issues in countries about payments and where there's a procurement happening and all of that, and that can lead to delays. And all of a sudden, maybe you end up having solved that and you need more. And then there are other things, as you can see on this slide. On the supply side, one of the things that I hear a lot outside is, or then there's a quality issue, a manufacturing quality issue, and then there's a supply issue. That can happen. That's one of the things that can happen. And because in some cases there are so few players in the market, so few manufacturers, what can happen is that if one all of a sudden cannot supply, the others cannot absorb that, and then we have a problem. And sometimes that's immediate that it happens, particularly when there's no stock available. It's really everything that's produced is being sold. One of the things that we will talk about today also, and I'll show that as a couple of examples, is the complexity of what we call post-approval changes. So post-approval changes might not sound that interesting a topic, but what happens is that as soon as you have an approval of a medicine or vaccine, the natural thing is that there are changes to the production. It could be that a supplier of raw material says, though, we're going to go out in business, we're not going to supply this, and you need to find something else. There might be a new technology that comes up, and we want to implement that. It might be that because of increased demand, we're putting a new facility on stream. And so changes after the initial license is happening. And I'll show on one of the next slides how that's being handled in the regulatory system is a challenge. Then there's additional testing in countries for some products, including vaccines. And that can cause shortages as well because of the time it takes. So for vaccines, what happens is that the company producing it tests the vaccine, But then also, in many cases, the country that you then supply to, the authorities there, the national laboratories, also test the vaccine. And vaccines are so complicated, and you see some variations. So you can have perfectly fine vaccine, but the in vivo assays, so the animal tests, have some variability because it's living systems. So let's say that you have maybe 15% risk of a perfectly fine batch to be seen as out of specification. Now, if you take that 15% and multiply it and say it's 15% if one tested, next time that's also 15%, so then we're up at 28% when you multiply it. And then after that, it's just 39. And if it's tested by 4 laboratories, it's just as likely that a perfectly fine batch is being rejected as being accepted, simply because of the variation, which many people don't think about, but that's really important to think about as well. And then there's just a real big diversity of packaging solutions and so on. So you might actually have one country that needs more of a vaccine or medicine, but you can't supply it because the packaging configuration is completely different. And it's like, oh, we have it in stock, but unfortunately it's different. So those are some of the things with that. If we look at it as a manufacturer, we are more and more, if we are across the world, so supplying globally, we are more and more seeing the world as one, that we would like this vaccine or this medicine to be supplied everywhere. Now it's being approved at a national level, and when there's a crisis, it's handled at a national level. And when there's a change, a possible change, it's handled at a national level. So as a manufacturer, if you're in all countries in the world, you will have more than 100 different countries to deal with, up to maybe 150. And each one of them can have their say whether they think this is a good change or not a good change. You can use the analogy a little bit like you have a car and you want to change something on the car. You want to put a new brake pads in or something like that. And every single country, so 100 different instances, needs to say yes before you can actually put the brake pad in and you can start driving. Or another analogy is when we board a plane, what if everybody have their own checklist to see that we are ready to fly? And it's different, these checklists. I don't think we would ever fly, but that's our situation for us today. So this is a global problem where we believe we need to have a global solution for this. So let me get into a specific example here as the next one. So first, the general thing about what manufacturers can do, and I think if there's one thing that I really want to come across here is, this is not a problem that can be solved if one party just does something else. We all have to do something else. And we all have to come to the table and say, what can we do? The first thing you could say that the manufacturers can do is have an early warning system and identify where are the risks in our supply chain and in our manufacturing. The other thing is, it's not only about manufacturing, it's all the way out to the patient or the person receiving a vaccine or medicine. So we need to think about that as well. And what are the risks along the way? Have an inventory, what are we doing about it, and so on. So that's one thing. The other thing is that today is very different than 10 and 15 years ago. There are expectations that every manufacturer has a very robust quality system. It's different from 15 years ago. It is an expectation, and we're inspected by regulatory agencies if we have that. So we have better validation, with better systems and so on. We need to continue doing that, making sure that we have effective quality system. We're also actually, even though putting these brake pads in is sometimes a big pain because it takes a lot of time, we are actually doing a lot of development of our industry. We are improving our methods and we're improving our processes, we're putting new technologies in, all that, and that helps. That helps a lot. And then we are doing the best we can to manage the country-specific requirements. We are doing that, but of course it's a challenge. And then I did mention the early notification. One thing to say is, even if the company has one way of doing that, we have to fill out individual forms for each country where there might be an issue. So we don't even have the same layout or requirements to that. Next one. This one, some of you picked up the brochure about the complex journey of a vaccine, and I really encourage you to read it, and it's also possible to get it online. I think it's a really illustrative, very good explanation of vaccines. So let me say that if you have a child who gets this combination vaccine, let's say it's 5 different diseases you treat in one injection, behind that is usually at least 5, maybe 8, 9, or 10 individual antigens that causes immune reaction. They're put together. They're usually produced by different methods. They're formulated, and then they're tested. And it's not unusual that you will have more than 1,000 tests being done from your start till you end, more than 1,000 tests. So it's very complex. And from you say, oh, I'm going to start producing the batch till you release it. I don't know if anyone of you know how long that takes, but for a combination vaccine, that's typically on the order of 2 years. So imagine that there's an outbreak, or a government says, oh, we really need a lot more. Can you deliver next week? We'd like 50% more. It's like, oh, we would love to. But now we're starting right today, and we'll come back 2 years from now with the batches. So that's very important to say. And testing is usually about 70% of that. So that's very important to say. Here's an example of the post-approval change. Again, this is an example where we did a manufacturing scale-up. So we increased the scale from 100% to 200%. So we doubled the capacity. And then we did slight modifications of the process to allow for this. But that's basically what it was. Now, that impacted 7 different vaccine products. It's licensed in 138 countries. Of these 138, 39 did not have a recording requirement. We could just do the change and say it maybe in an annual report. 37 had minor reporting requirements and 62 had major. So the first thing you see is it's not the same classification and it's not the same documentation level in these countries. So this is, everyone can see this makes sense. It's actually because there's a demand which is much higher than the worldwide capacity. So we made this doubling the capacity to meet the demand better. There were 22 countries that raised 177 questions, but there were actually only 19 questions because some of them had similar questions. So now we have one change, 138 countries, 62 of them were major classification, 37 were minor, and 19 different questions. How long do you think that's going to take to get that all through? 5 years. So that one change, simple, just scale up, get it through, all of that. We're putting the brake pads in the car. It's better. We get a new safety belt. It's better safety and all that. Before we can actually start that car, 5 years. How do you think you can stay current if it takes 5 years to make any change? Imagine that just again with your phone and say, okay, I want to make a change and it's going to take 5 years. How many versions of a smartphone will you have in 5 years? In the pharma industry, we cannot innovate in weeks or months. We innovate sometimes in decades. And that's a really big problem. Now, let me show you how it works in general then. This is, I'm not going to go into every single column and cell here on this one, but this is reality. This is a pentavalent vaccine, so treating 5 different diseases. And 1 year, we made 83 batches. Hold on here. According to 55 different processes of variations. So some had that extra brake pad in, some had an extra safety belt, some had another type of indicator light or something like that. 55 different ways of making 83 batches to the exact same specification. So the one vaccine that gets on the market has exactly the same specification. Now, this happens because every time you put a change in, it takes 5 years from first country to last country. Then you have another change, another change, another change. So at some point you have an inventory that is so fragmented. So we have 83 batches, and we've got 55 versions of it. So it might say, country A says, oh, we need some more material. And we say, yep, we got it, but you have version 38, and we don't have more of 38. Do you like a 52? And they say, no, we haven't approved that, and it's going to take probably a couple of years. Oh, that's a shame, because we have the product, but it's not approved. So that's a really big problem here. That shows reality again. And what this, just to explain a little bit, what it says is it's the 83 batches on the rows, and it's the 55 versions on the in the columns. And then you can see we need for every single order, we need to look, okay, this order for this country, let's see, they can do that, and they can do that, and they can do that. We'll make sure that that's... I sometimes, a little jokingly, but not really, say that the most challenging job in the pharma industry is head of supply chain. It's figuring out who gets what, and what's the risk of sending something wrong when it's so complicated. Okay, so let's take the next one. Solutions, and then we'll continue here. We in the industry have listed 4 different solutions that we think will be good. One is there should be some time limits. If every single change is open for 5 years, what if that was 1 year? That would be good. Then at least you know there will never be anything open for more than a year, and there will be at any time less open theoretically. The other thing is, why don't we have the same documentation requirements? Every time we do a change, it's assessed on a scientific level, quality, safety, efficacy, every change. And it's really important, and there needs to be checks and balances. There needs to be somebody saying, as an independent party, say, yeah, this looks good, and so on. But why does a scientific assessment has to be national scientific assessment? And again, the car analogy. If you think about cars 10 years ago, they were less complicated than cars today. It's the same with our technologies. They get more and more complex. And being able to cope with that from a regulatory perspective, from regulatory agency perspective, is getting more and more difficult, simply because you need to have some different qualifications. And you cannot expect that in the case here that I showed, that 138 countries all are up to the latest standards. So if some could do it for others, that would be really good. But if we could have the same requirements, that would be good. It should really be. The funny thing is we actually have it. So WHO has a guideline for post-approval changes. It's just not used by everybody in the world. But there is one. There is one. Then, in some cases, things that are simple, we should cover just in the company's quality system, not have to supply it. For vaccines, every time we have a reference standard change of a batch, that has to be approved around the world as well. By the time it's approved in the last country, it's probably consumed, and we need to submit the next one. So there should be things that we don't have to, that are obvious, that we don't have to submit. And then the last thing is something that WHO is working a lot on, what's called mutual reliance or convergence, regulatory convergence, countries working together. If there's a country that has approved this already, could other countries just piggyback on that and say, oh, that sounds good. Somebody has independently look at it. So, next one. So we come to the conclusion. The first thing is we need to have a dialogue, and we need to not sit and say, you need to change and you need to change. We all need to change, and we all need to come to the table and have this dialogue. It's becoming too complex. That plane cannot leave anymore if everybody needs to do the checklist, or that car cannot drive anymore. It's also important to say, because to put the new brake pads in or something else on the car, if it takes 5 years, you might be tempted not to do it. Because, it's working, so I'm not going to do it. And that's actually also happening, that sometimes companies do not put the change in that they would like to, because they say, it's going to take 5 years. And it costs a lot to have all these approvals and so on. So we're not going to do it. We wait till the car breaks down. And that's usually, if you try that with an old car, it's usually when you want the least that happens. And that happens for us as well. Sometimes something breaks down because it's just old. And we would like to do it. But when it takes 5 years to get to the current status, it's not as tempting. We're saying here, policymakers, health authorities, countries, scientific experts, manufacturers need to work together. That's what I said. We really need an incentive as manufacturers to innovate. Individual countries say, oh, we'd like you to innovate and so on. And some regulations actually says we need to have the latest technology. But why is it that each country have their own requirements then? It is, yeah, we would really like to put the brake pads in, the new brake pads into this car. Can't you just agree on what the requirements are instead of everybody have it their own way? And then again, we have to work together. So that was the introduction from me. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anders. He's done most of our work for us this morning. Okay, so the plan for the rest of this morning is I'm going to ask the rest of we've already met, Anders, we're going to ask the rest of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and explain how shortages affect the organisations that you represent. Then we'll have a discussion about potential solutions and what needs to happen for those solutions to become a reality. Then we'll invite the audience to ask the panelists questions, and then we'll have lunch. So, Luc.
Hello, so my name is Luc Besançon. I'm the CEO of the World Pharmacists Association. It's called FIP. And why maybe pharmacists are bothered about shortages? I think it's primarily for the patient. Too often we've seen shortages have tremendous impact on the patient, the inability to be treated, the loss of chance basically for the patient. So as early 2010, some of our national associations approach us to say we see more and more shortages impacting patients and we would like FIP to work on that matter. So we organized in 2013 a summit on this issue and eventually supported WHO in consultation in 2015 on this issue, trying to find solution, analyze the situation and eventually find solution, which eventually were translated into the WHO resolution in 2016. I think it's really important, two things. One is sometimes we talk about reasons, but we have very weak evidence about the reasons and the quantification. They're very, very partial. Second is I would like to recognize industries in eventually talking openly about this issue. I think in some years it was very a difficult topic to handle, and now it's a good opportunity now today to have that discussion there. In addition to some of the reasons that have been mentioned by the previous speaker, there's a number of elements that I would like to highlight. One is the impact of regulatory decision on shortages, on how decisions can induce shortages. I think there's a number of evidence we have identified, including, for instance, the Sandoz cases in Canada. Second is the impact not only about quality of manufacturing, but also the way manufacturing is done. After the tsunami in Japan, there's a manufacturing plant from Roche who has been hit by the tsunami. And this was the only manufacturing plant that was providing medicines for the whole world. As we have a globalization of the production, it also means that if there is any challenges on that particular line of productions, you will lead to major shortages. That's maybe something to consider as well. They also have all the financial elements in terms of accessibility to foreign currencies. For instance, in Venezuela, now you have about 85% of medicines that are in shortage in the private sector because there's no more access to the dollars given the political situation there, but also the inability to pay, as for instance in Greece and in financial cases as well. You have parallel import that have and parallel export that have strong impact there. Some regulatory authority have estimated that some parallel import in Eastern European countries has led to shortage in that countries, and other countries benefited from that import there. The way also tenders are organized and also the time where it's supposed to be delivered has also been increasing as you get mega tenders and the delivery time is supposed to be in a week, months. That's put pressure. Lean supply chain is a major challenge. As we get more effective in the supply chain, it means we have no more or less stock, and the stock is using as a buffer. If there is any supply disruptions for any reason, the stock that is at the wholesaler, at the industry, and at the community pharmacy will help to ensure that supply disruptions does not lead to a shortage. And so as we get more effective in the lean supply chain, this also means that we have a higher risk, or we are less able to use that buffer effect for that. And also the interruption of commercialization, whether it's based on a profitability analysis from the industry, meaning it's no more profitable, also as you need to implement maybe a new supply production line. This also, for an aging facilities, you might say, well, my return on investment is on 10 years and I don't have the visibility that allows me to say, to take that commercial decision to say, is it worth for me to take the risk or not? So there's really a high numbers of elements. And the other element around increased demand is once the government usually or the advisory groups are changing the vaccination recommendation, it's usually effective as of now. So it means there's no visibility for the producers to say, well, I will certainly have an increase of my demand there. Second example, in a number of countries now, pharmacists have been authorized to immunize in the community pharmacy. And usually this is authorized and implemented the same year. And it's very positive for us that we are effective, but it also means for the industry, like in Portugal when it was implemented for the flu immunization, we've been, as a pharmacist, maybe too effective in the sense that the stock available was not sufficient, because we've been able to increase the immunization rate to a higher extent at a very short period of time, because it was just on a 6 months time that eventually this was made possible. So there's really a high level of reasons with very little quality analysis around what the respective contribution, and usually there's not one single reason. So sometimes we are trying to say, well, it's manufacturing or it's increased demands. Usually this is really a high level of combinations. And that's where it's crucial, when we will discuss about solution a bit later, to consider a coordinated approach there. For the vaccine sector, we have developed a report, and it's on the table in the back of the rooms around what the shortages and what are the recommendations we suggested. But the vaccine have, I think, 4 major characteristics that are specific to them or are more important compared to other medicines. The first one is that you have a higher concentration of producer. So usually in a country level, you have a few producers for a specific vaccine, which means that there's less spread of the risk. If one is unable to deliver, there's less other groups that can easily take over and help with that. Second, there's a longer time of production. So if there is any failure in the productions or quality failure, or if you have to produce quickly, you cannot produce quickly. You can produce, but it would take a longer time to get a proper solution. Third element, there's a risk specific to vaccines around cold chain management. That you could lose a whole batch that has been quality approved from the supply chain if there is a cold chain break. Whereas as other medicines that are not subject to cold chain management, you're not really so much concerned by that particular point. And eventually also that an impact on the shortages mean that you will be delaying the immunization of a specific group. So when the shortage is over, not only you need to cover the population that should have been immunized at the time, but also the population that is there. So there's an element around that when a shortage is resolved, you will certainly have an increase in not only in demand, but also in the workload of all the immunization team that will really create things. And we'll stop here. Thank you.
Anne, please.
Thank you. My name is Anne Ottosen. I'm working with the UNICEF supply division in Copenhagen. For the last 10 years, I've been mostly engaged in new vaccine introductions in developing and low-income countries. And before joining UNICEF, I was working with a government-owned Danish vaccine manufacturer for more than a decade, where I was responsible for global sales of vaccines, but also procurement of all vaccines for the Danish market. And I liked Anders' analogy about the car development. I'm happy that somebody developed the air condition in my car. I was just thinking 20 years ago, if they decided that that was not a worthwhile investment, where we would be today. Last year, UNICEF procured 2.5 billion doses of vaccines, supplying vaccines to 100 countries around the world. the vaccines we procured reach about 45% of the children of the world. So we have a huge role, and we are probably the largest global buyer of vaccines, which of course takes some responsibilities, comes with that considerable role. In the late 1990s, there were a lot of crises in the vaccine supply market to UNICEF, and we did a different procurement approach back then. Since then, we've aimed through our procurement to achieve vaccine security, which is the uninterrupted, sustainable supply of affordable vaccines of assured quality to be supplied through UNICEF. So that's what we're aiming to achieve. And I think there are a number of areas or a number of challenges where we often see the interruptions of supplies or the shortages of supply. There is a huge accountability, of course, on the country level, where there are issues even when vaccines are available at the global level, but where we're not able to get the vaccines to reach the last child at the country office due to conflict or due to supply chain challenges or a number of issues. And we're working with countries to strengthen that, of course, together with partners at the country level, but also at the global level. For the new vaccine introductions, where we often planning way in advance, like for the decision in 2013, where the SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts to WHO, recommended that all countries should introduce at least one dose of inactivated polio vaccine in their program before the switch in 2016. We had years of advance notice, and we also had intensive consultations with manufacturers prior to going ahead with that strategy or policy recommendation. And irrespective of that, we're yet today in a situation where we're not able to supply inactivated polio vaccines to all of the countries, and a number of countries, 35 countries, still do not have access. So even when we have well-prepared introductions and planned innovations in the program, then we do experience shortages. What does it mean to UNICEF that we have these stockouts, but as well as the global shortages? Well, it means that we're not able to deliver on our commitments to children. We're not able to support children in the world to survive and to thrive and to reach their full potential. So it's a very serious matter, and we're very pleased that this issue is also taken very seriously by IFPMA and industry, and that's also what we experience through our engagements and through our ongoing discussions and consultations with manufacturers, that it is a serious issue. And this is not an issue that can be solved by industry or by the programs, but has to be a joint collaborative effort. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Tania.
My name is Tania Cernuschi. I work in WHO, the expanded program for immunization here in Geneva in the Department of Immunization, Vaccines and Biologics. My role there is really on access to vaccine supply, and there's two dimensions to this really. One is affordability, which we're not touching upon today. The other one is availability, which is very relevant to the discussion here. The work we do on access to vaccine supply is in the context of broader frameworks, such as the sustainable immunization for middle-income countries, as well as immunization in humanitarian emergencies. But we don't really focus or exclude on a particular group of countries or exclude others. We really have a global focus and attempt to provide for all our member states. There's another important crucial framework that we refer to as we do any work in this area, which is the Global Vaccine Action Plan. You're all familiar with, and in particular the fifth objective of it that really puts a target for the global community to ensure that countries have funding, technologies, and supply available to reach immunization goals. So it's really in this context that we work on access to supply, and shortages is certainly a relative, a very important matter. Essentially, we've been hearing from member states more and more that this is an issue both for vaccines but also for medicines. We don't have a full understanding of the extent of this, but what we know is that we believe this is increasing, and we know this for at least for cancer medicines, for antibiotics, and for vaccines. So what we did in the Department of Immunization, Vaccine and Biologics is we did look into the case of vaccines to understand the extent of the problem. And we did some of this work in collaboration with partners, including UNICEF, Supply Division last year in April, and we presented it to our strategic advisory group of experts on immunization. And we assessed that essentially for about 60% of vaccines, we either have a shortage or we are at risk of shortage. So this is for us really an important issue. We have, you know, as Anders rightly mentioned, we don't really have a definition for shortage yet. We are working on this. There's more than 50 definitions out there, so it's kind of difficult to measure. But another way to look at it is to look at stockouts, even though there's only a share of stockouts that are caused by global shortages. But we see that in the past 5 years, over 3 countries in the world has reported a stockout to us of at least one product each year. So this is really important. For us, what really matters, not being a procurement agency or not having necessarily a strong role on the supply side, other than, of course, the crucial function on setting standards and regulatory matters. What's important to us is really the impact on the immunization program and on the ability of countries to reach targets, and it's difficult to measure the impact for sure. But what we know is that certainly there are missed opportunities when providers are not able to access supply. We also guess and think it's a fairly informed guess that that a vicious circle is created where the confidence then in the immunization systems wanes. There's already a problem of hesitancy that was mentioned at the beginning of this session, and clearly when parents go to a clinic and don't access supply, you're not sure that they will come back, and you can have some long-term negative effects there. And then there's an important consequence in terms of time to find solution for providers, and a cost for finding more expensive solution if countries have to switch for a more expensive product. So there are certainly consequences, even though we're maybe not able to measure the impact in terms of increased disease or mortality. What we hear from countries, why we are involved is really member states that have brought this to our attention. What we understand from them is that they put in place different coping strategies. These tend to be very reactive. So in the face of a shortage, they look for a different supplier, they look for a different product, they put together some mutual support solutions, they change their schedule, they do what they can to avoid stopping vaccination, but at times they have to. So we've actually ran a survey in our European region last year, and several countries did confirm that they had to stop vaccination for several months. Then, of course, they do catch-up campaigns to try and address the vaccinations that were missed, but there's certainly an impact in terms of interruption of service. And very simply, countries have turned to us to ask for support and for solutions. So this is why we're in this business right now. We have 2 resolutions that were already, or at least one was already mentioned. One specific on vaccines that also addresses the issue of shortages. That was a resolution of the 68th World Health Assembly, and then one last year on medicines and vaccines specific to shortages. Resolution 69.25, where we are asked as WHO to again have an assessment of the magnitude of the issue, and then help with the definition of shortages so that assessment can actually be effective, and then look into setting up some sort of a notification system, which was also mentioned here in terms of solution, but we don't want to get there yet. But this is clearly right now a priority area for us.
Okay, thanks. Anders, do you want to add a few comments regarding impact from the industry's point of view, or shall we be happy to.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about some of the comments, which are all very relevant. One thing that I was thinking about, so is it getting worse or better? Where's the needle going? Is it worse or better? It's getting worse. It's significantly getting worse. And one of the reasons for that is that there was a World Health Assembly Resolution 67.20, which makes a lot of sense, where countries around the world are encouraged to have a stronger regulatory agency, kind of develop their own guidelines and so on. But that means that these people who want to check the car, the extra brakes we put into, or the new brakes we put into the car, there's more who want to check it now. And they don't use what is already there. They have, again, their own checklist and so on. So there's more and more checking. So I've also been thinking about, is this something, why do we have this conversation now? Why is it now? And I think it's because it has become so big a problem, and there's more and more of the stakeholders who appreciate we're going to do this different. We have to look at this differently. And I think that now is the right time to get together and talk about how can we all change a little bit and find really good solutions. At the end of the day, I have 3 kids. I want to make sure they get their vaccinations. They got the vaccinations so far and so on. We're all people and want to make sure that the medicines and the vaccines are available to all those who need it, no matter whether we work in UNICEF as a pharmacist or WHO or industry, where we work, we're all humans, and we want to make sure we find a solution.
Absolutely. Okay, before we move on to solutions, I just want to point out at the back, Sarah, who has the very ambitious task of documenting this discussion visually. And I can't believe it, she's already, look how busy she's been. Maybe at the end, maybe not all of you together, but you can go and see what she's produced. I'll be very interested to see. Have you got a picture of me up there yet? Oh, I can see. Okay, let's talk about solutions. Luke, what would you like to see happen? And what do we need to do to get that in place?
We have identified 6 major areas where we think medicine shortage and vaccine shortage can be better handled and eventually prevented by this 6 approach. So approach number 1 is really around the information system. We know cases of shortage. We don't know the extent. I cannot compare it. We cannot. If you don't measure something, even if it's there, it's in existence to the policymakers and to the rest of the people. So having an information systems where at national level you are able to report what the cases are, understanding the reason, eventually when the expected solutions are provided, and a few other elements would really be useful in informing the policy, in informing the debate at national level. And if you agglomerate that at international, maybe at a later stage, it will really help us to see what is really the problems we try to solve. We see the shortage is there, but understanding the reason for the shortage would be crucial. So that's number 1. We've seen good example from Pharmacists Association taking the lead in that in the US. So in France, for instance, they have taken the lead in collecting the data from pharmacists around, I was not able to get that vaccine, to get that medicines, and being able to offer that. And providing this information also to the regulatory authorities, so in the US to the FDA, so then they also are able to engage the data. Number 2, also analyzing the risk, and whether you call it a list of vulnerable or critical medicines, what are the risks at national level? I'll give you an example. Some for other medicines, other than than vaccines, you may have 10 producers, but if all of them have the same active pharmaceutical ingredients source, if there is a problem with that source, you have shortage, inability to produce them for all the groups. So the numbers of producers is not even sometimes sufficient to understand effectively what are the critical matters. So it's about what's the vulnerability of supply. It's about the complexity of production. It's about the number of redundant sites of production or not. It's about the ability to substitute. All this is some of the criteria that could be helping to be developed at national level, because as you said, registration is at national level, so you need to have that. We can provide general guidance around that, but it's still an exercise at national level reflecting this. So then at the end, we are able to provide and to define from this list of critical products a specific mitigation risk, whether it's produced by the manufacturers or as a coordinated effort. That's up to the country to help decide in that. And also it helps to inform and eventually prepare any answers. Third cases is really to try to consider what we have called high quality active procurement process. How does your procurement process provide and support not only quality of the products, but also sustainability and certainty that the products will be made available? So it's about tender, it's about costing, it's about better forecasting. It's all about that would help to get that discussion. Sometimes you have challenges because it would be antitrust authorities would be not so happy to have that sharing of information. But for us, this is really something important. Fourth element, as mentioned earlier, removing all the regulatory barriers to make it easier for the producer and eventually to help to move one batch from another country when there is a shortage there. Fifth, to really try to have a clearly defined organization within the country, a body that is in charge with the issue of shortages. Whether it's the medical authority, whether it's the Ministry of Health, whether it's the registration authority, someone clearly is in charge of that topic. And not only in charge of measuring it, but also providing guidance to the policymakers around if we have a shortage or if we have tension on the stock, what should be the priorities? How do we strategize the people who should receive the medicines and the vaccines versus others? And that's an important element also for the healthcare professionals to be able to apply that in an evidence-based approach. And six, I think, is around really trying to develop and share evidence-based mitigation risk. We can try to prevent, but also we need to see how we can also have best practice around dealing with cases and how best we can have to limit the impact of shortages. Because unfortunately, we don't anticipate that shortage will disappear in 5 years' time. Even if all this is starting to be moving, it will still take some time before we can solve that.
Okay. Anne?
Yeah, I'm just being inspired by some of your interventions. And I think what we heard during the SAGE meeting over the past couple of days was actually that 10 European countries do not have access to diphtheria tetanus combination vaccine, which is a very basic vaccine. And I was quite surprised to hear that actually, because we have ample supply under UNICEF contracts, but this of course plays into the whole issue about the regulatory approval processes and the products that are actually produced and available, do they meet requirements? And they haven't undergone, of course, licensure processes in Europe. So I think there's also this discussion about what do we mean with a shortage? Is there a real shortage, or is it other aspects that are actually preventing that these vaccines are reaching the children that need the vaccine? So I thought that was just an interesting reflection. I think also what was discussed was diphtheria antitoxin, that there is a global shortage and countries cannot get access to that product to actually treat disease, and what can be done. Can we build global stockpiles of that? But you need to have the product administered relatively shortly after diagnosis in order to prevent death. So global stockpile may not be a solution for that. We of course need to see how can we prevent that these shortage situations occur. And first of all, of course, we have our hopes high for new technologies and new platforms that will allow us to rapidly scale up vaccine production, so we can meet in case there is an outbreak or an epidemic, so that we're able to meet the requirements and to prevent mortality and morbidity. I think from our perspective, from UNICEF, what we're also doing is that we aim to incentivize more manufacturers to enter into specific supply markets where we are aware that we have a fragile supply basis, where we only have 1 or 2 vaccine manufacturers. Through our communication with industry, we are trying to encourage and incentivize that more manufacturers develop more vaccines to ensure a broader supply base, because we do know that vaccines are biological products and manufacturers will from time to time have issues with production. And we're seeing that not just for new vaccines, but we're also seeing that for very traditional vaccines that have been in the market for many, many years. Like yellow fever is a vaccine where we have a chronic shortage of supply and we can't get enough doses to both run outbreak response, preventive campaigns, and routine programs. So there are a number of ways to move forward on that. I think also as the world embark on new programs, and that's where we often see the shortages, like as I mentioned before, the IPV rollout in 126 countries. We saw the same situation when we had the pentavalent vaccine back in 2001, which became available through this financial support of Gavi, where 73 countries after 14 years finally had introduced. But in the early years, we only had a single supplier, and countries had to introduce other product presentations because there wasn't enough supply capacity. So I think if we prepare better in advance, if we work together to fully understand the limitations on the supply side, but also are working better to prepare demand forecasts, then at least we are in better position to manage expectations also on countries. I would say that the current IPV shortage has caused a lot of frustrations both with countries and partners coming out with a policy recommendation. They're not being able to supply the vaccines that are needed for countries to introduce or implement. I think for UNICEF, because we have many countries and we usually have many suppliers, there are some coping mechanisms that we're talking about, short-term shortages that we can work on. But this does require that industry notifies us well in advance about the issues, and considering the several years of production lead time, manufacturers will have to tell us earlier on that there is an issue that will impact your supply in a year and a half from now, perhaps, so that we also have some opportunities to either work with other manufacturers, work with countries to understand what are their stock levels, to better ration supplies to countries. Some countries receive a shipment per year, other countries receive shipments every second month. So we have some tools and some options as long as we're notified well in advance. So that is really my plea to industry, be very transparent and open about this. And I think we're in this sort of together. And if we can do anything to better use the available supply, I think we should do that. And then also you mentioned also the issue about ensuring buffers at different levels in the supply chain, both at the manufacturer, of course, but also at country level. And that's what we operate with as well. We don't introduce a new vaccine in a country unless there is 3 months additional supply in order us to vaccinate all of the refrigerators as we talk about. So a number of options for prevention and coping mechanisms.
Thank you. Thank you. Tania?
Yes, difficult to talk about more solutions. So many have already been mentioned. I think when we explain the issue and we come up with so many causes, we're already saying that the solution is going to be extremely complicated. And I think one point I'd like to emphasize from your presentation is really that also the causes are different for different vaccines. If we're discussing a traditional vaccine like BCG, it's very different if we're talking about a vaccine that is prone to outbreaks, like in the case of yellow fever. It's a different story where we're talking about IPV, where there's a global plan for simultaneous introduction across the world. It's really very different. I mean, there's certainly cross-cutting issues. We had an opportunity to discuss with some of the colleagues here yesterday. But there's also very big specificities about each vaccine market. So for me, as we think of solutions, we have to keep that in mind, and I think that helps to formulate concrete steps forward in each market if we are aware of that, rather than try and find magic bullets, if you wish, that can address all causes across all products. Another point I'd like to put emphasis on is the idea of a global problem requiring global solutions. What we've done as part of the very initial work that we're doing in this area is to map out across the world and across all vaccines who's doing what to preempt and manage shortages. And what we see is that there are plenty of actors out there that have a function in this space, and they're tackling all the different causes that we've been mentioning. So there are some active on the supply side with market shaping activities. or working on the regulatory sides aspects that impact supply. There's a lot of work going into the demand and working with countries to harmonize registration procedures and better forecasting and making demand more predictable. Where we during that exercise, where we noticed a possible gap and where we hope to offer some solution from our side is in the in-between supply and demand information exchange. So there's an issue with incomplete information that was already raised and an issue of dialogue between the supply and the demand side. And clearly I'm simplifying here, this is not for every vaccine or for every market, but we think that for some vaccines and for some markets, countries, there is a gap in information, both in terms of collecting, sharing, analyzing this information and creating dialogue on potential issues. And so this is the area that we are hoping to fund resources to work on as WHO to complement fundamentally the work that is already done by agencies that again may have a more specific focus in this area. This is really from an IVB standpoint from the immunization department at WHO. Clearly as an organization we have a wider engagement and a wider set of solutions to put in place in this space. I've been mentioning the work that our essential medicine department is going to be doing in defining shortages and at least getting us a step forward towards being able to measure the extent of the problem. They're working on possibility of setting up a monitoring reporting system for shortages. There's work that is done by a regulatory team on setting standards and on harmonizing registrations and post-approval changes, guidelines and so forth. So there's plenty of other work and other solutions out there. There's also work that we are doing in IVB on supply chain that depending on how you define shortages and whether you stop at the national level or go beyond is also a contributing factor. But in IVB, really, I think the area we want to put emphasis on is filling in the information gap.
Okay, thanks for that. And as I know you spoke about solutions earlier, is there something that you'd like to highlight here?
Yeah, I was just thinking about one of the things you said, Anne. So diphtheria and tetanus were in 2017. There should not be a shortage of diphtheria and tetanus that has been around so long. It should be an expectation that is always available, but it's not. And there are shortages in terms of that and other vaccines also in Europe, in the US, everywhere in the world. And if I can share a little bit of frustration, and we as manufacturers are then being asked to fill out a form a little bit differently for this country and a little bit different for that country, and this country wants a little bit more different version of this documentation, and one wants a extra stability report and so on. And we are talking about kids not getting their vaccines, basic vaccines in 2017. And I think that's where, again, share my frustration, we have to come together. This should not happen in this day and age. It should not happen. So I think we really all have to think about, we need to set aside our own stakeholder interests and see what we can do. Again, on the solution side, I'll say, as an industry, we have become better and we need to become even better at the forecasting of where are the potential risks. I don't know if you've seen the statistics for drug shortage in the US, but that was actually after the US introduced legislation about this, about suppliers having to inform of the potential of a drug shortage at a certain time in advance. Actually, drug shortages went down. And that was because the FDA worked with the manufacturers about what can we then do? Could we do this? Could we do that? And so on. So there was some flexibility to make sure that it doesn't happen. And the actual numbers went down. And I think we can do that all over the world. And there are individual countries that are doing the same now. There's an organization, Parenteral Drug Association, PDA, that has developed a technical report that actually for each product you can go in doing sort of a triage model, and you can say, depending on what's the criticality of this in terms of what you're treating, and how can you categorize and what's the mitigation come up. We recommend all companies to do that. Use that. Do a better advanced notice system for that. That's one we can do. We will continue to invest in our facilities. And we are working with agencies around the world. So we want to continue what we're doing, but we just can see it's not sustainable. So again, on the solution side, I think it's about forecasting and it's about reduced complexity. And then I think we really need to do a good analysis of what is exactly the problem, what are the exact root causes, so do some extra analysis there. There are some now, but I think we need to do a more thorough job. And on the solution side, again, the way I see it, there's no doubt we have to reduce that regulatory complexity. There are numbers of ways doing mutual recognition or reliance. There's less changes that needs to be reported if the company show with an effective quality system that this is actually a better situation. The funny thing is that if you can show objectively that you are in a better situation in terms of reducing process variability or improve the patient safety or something, even if you objectively can show it, it takes 5 years before you can implement it. And it shouldn't be the case. If you can objectively show that this is a better situation, you should be able to do it much faster. And then one thing we didn't talk that much about, but that redundant testing, as I would call it, the national agencies or national laboratories doing that additional testing. Most other areas are not doing that anymore, but we have it for vaccines. You can actually have, I was looking through our files and so on, we have one product where you can have the same batch tested in animals 10 times. So first us, and then 9 countries around the world. And if you take that statistics about the variability of biologics assays, when you get to the 9s, even if it's a good batch, the statistics say that somewhere along those 10 tests, it's going to fail. And what do you do if number 8 fails with the first 7 and so on? So that's just, it adds time, it adds complexity. It's not that we don't want these national laboratories or agencies to look at what we're doing. We're totally open books and so on, and so you come and see what we're doing and we work with you and so on. It's just complexifying it too much. So those are some of the things at high level, I would say.
Listening to you talk, it's a miracle we've got any vaccines at all.
Well, actually, there was one of the, I would say one of the CEOs for one of the vaccine companies said every time we release a batch, it's a miracle. Because the opportunities for failure is so high. If you take 8 or 9 individual drug substances or antigens, all the process steps it goes through, the hundreds of people that are involved, the thousands of tests, it is almost a miracle. But we do it every day because we've got good systems and we've got people who are trained and all of that. But then there are many opportunities. I like your wording.
Thank you. We'll move to a Q&A, but I'm just going to start that off by asking a few quick questions, if that's okay. Anders, could industry be more transparent about notifying people like Anne about potential shortages?
Yes, of course we can. We can always improve. I think we have improved over the last few years as an industry. I mean, I'm working in one company and I worked in other companies, so I can't speak for everybody. But my sense is that there's more dialogue than there was 5 or 10 years ago. I think, so there is some there. I think we need to be rigorous about what I said. Our medicines prevention plans or vaccine prevention plans, we need to be very rigorous as a company and come early and have conversations with agencies around the world. I think we need to continue that. It worked, as the example I said, with the US, has worked in general for the industry and ultimately for patients. So I think, yeah, that's the number one thing we can do. The second one is to make sure that our systems are robust. So that miracle, it becomes less of a miracle. It becomes more routine that we actually produce batches that are usually making it all the way through, the more we can do there, the better it is. So those are the things, two things are things in terms of transparency and what we can really do.
Okay. And maybe one for Anne. Anne, how feasible, you know, this is not my specialist talk, how feasible, ethical is the stockpiling of vaccines? You know, is that something that we do?
Yeah, I'm actually happy that you raised this question, because for some areas we do have stockpiles. I mean, this has been an increasing tool for outbreak response prone diseases like yellow fever, meningitis and cholera vaccine. I think we discussed it briefly for IPV as well, but the ethical considerations about depriving children from having access to a vaccine because you want to stockpile it at the global level, I mean, you have to be very careful about those considerations that are driving your assessment. So I think if we can do in advance, we can build up stockpiles, because we know there are specific diseases where you will not be able to scale up production rapidly enough to meet an outbreak response without impacting the routine supply. Then that could be an opportunity, of course. But you also know that if you deprive the routine system, then you also build up the susceptible population, and thereby a risk of an outbreak increases. So it's not a magic bullet, as Tania was saying. It's something that has to be considered carefully by disease, by vaccine, and based on the industry capacity as well.
Right, yeah. Right, okay. Okay, let's see if we've got any questions. If you could just tell us who you are before you start. And I think we have a travelling microphone.
I think he was first. Give that courtesy. Okay, thank you. Jean Fremont, Dialogue Geneva. Two quick questions. The Summit on Medicine Shortage 4 years ago came out with 6 recommendations. How far are you in the implementation? Second question, if a head of state was asking you, what are your priorities when addressing shortages, what would you answer? And no more than 2 or 3 priorities. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Anders says it's easy, so he's going to go first, and then Luke.
The second question, I can answer the first, but the second question, keep increasing the robustness of our manufacturing. New technologies, robustness, that's the best we can do as a manufacturer, really.
Okay, Luke?
For the first question, if you compare, for instance, WHO resolutions with the recommendation there, you see there's quite a good match, about 80 to 90% of the recommendation there. Pharmacists, since the 2013, a number of our national stations have worked hard to get this. So for instance, France, the reporting system that is now integrated has been implemented after 2013. And we will also release next week, hopefully, or in 2 weeks' time, a report around what are the reporting system that has been implemented in the world, so then you also are able to share best practices that can be used at global level or at national level by a national station. Usually for pharmacists, what we ask at national level is, let's be also involved with other healthcare professionals. It's not only a discussion around agencies and the industry. We are the one, at the end of the day, that is in contact with the patients and with the prescribers to say, what do I do with it? And that's an element there. So I think the prescribing part is something, the reporting part is really something that a lot of our national stations are engaging and are monitoring actively. And the second part is then trying to stimulate that discussion at national level, because we are maybe a neutral stakeholder there, in the sense that there's not really a strong economic interest from our side. There's no thing agenda. Agenda is driven by the patients there.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment there? No. Okay. The lady behind.
First of all, I just want to say a big thank you to the panelists for really tackling a very complex set of issues here and doing so eloquently and articulately. I have a comment, but I want to give an analogy first, because I think it helps you understand sort of my comment.
Can I just ask you who you are, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Joan Benson with Merck Vaccines.
Right.
So here's my analogy, and I think I kind of alluded to it in a conversation yesterday. You know, as a mother and someone who's given birth to, you know, a number of children, I recall that my first child, when I was pregnant with my second child, and he would always ask me, when is my sister coming? And I would say to him, in 9 months.
That was at the beginning. And a couple of months later, he would say, oh, how many more months? And I would say, in 7 months, in 6 months. But it didn't matter that I had told him 9 months, right? He still kept asking, when is she coming? So I say this only to say that, you know what, there is, to the point of manufacturing lead times, the timing is what it is. It doesn't change, and that's a natural, we all know that. So just as a pregnancy is expected to terminate in 9 months, that child is not going to come out before 9 months, except there are extenuating circumstances. Now, so the point I'm trying to hammer home is the one of timeliness of our communication, number one, and then also managing the expectations of those communications, because we know that for manufacturing lead times, here's what it takes. And it doesn't matter how many more times we ask the question, it's not going to change. So we need to bear that in mind as we're thinking about, you know, engagement with manufacturers, you know, the stakeholders all coming together, and that the manufacturers are a key component of helping, you know, in that, solving that problem. But we all need to be at the table, and there needs to be realistic expectations of what those manufacturing lead times really are, and an appreciation of that, and incorporating that into the total planning.
I think that's a fair point. We basically need to tell countries that the baby's not going to come any sooner, and to just, you know, accept this.
If I may comment on that, I mean, we've had these conversations before. I would definitely agree with everything you said, and it goes to the point about information and dialogue, right? So if the earlier we know about demands and the earlier manufacturers can be notified. I think, though, not to foolish ourselves, we need to be realistic also that there are different settings out there and different skills and institutional strength, which will bring some variability to the extent we can do that across the world. So we maybe touch about that later, but I see it, at least in the world of immunization, the world is divided in different segments, and for some segments, and I'm thinking of countries that are supported heavily with external financing, you may, or not, but you may be able to have a more predictable demand and a notification system and respect those lead times so that no shortage occurs. There's other contexts where this is more complicated for countries that may fund and procure on their own and may have less capacity to forecast and a fairly weak procurement system. So I don't think the solution for those countries is so easy, even if a dialogue is created. We haven't talked about this, but I think one piece of the solution is also strengthening procurement and all that goes with procurement, forecasting, planning skills for those countries. And to be fair, I don't think that the international community is right now prepared really in that area, nor resourced to provide this support to these countries. It's certainly a gap.
Right, Luke.
I think just to maybe take over the analogy about pregnancy, if you consider a shortage this time as a pregnancy, it's always good to have a pregnancy test to know that it's coming up, rather than discovering on the day of delivery, oh, I'm pregnant, by the way, and we haven't prepared anything at home. I'm joking on that, but just to say the relevance of early information also allows everybody to be able to respond and to welcome, or to at least know how to handle the shortage, and to have it coordinated between the families, between the healthcare facilities and everything. That's just a little joke.
Anders?
Yeah, my head is not working fast enough to continue on the analogy. Sorry about that. But what I will say is that it still happens that regular agencies or the one who buy the vaccines come and ask, can you do it in 7 months where it's 9 months and so on. And that, as you say, we know the answer to that. What I will add to that, I'll add two things. One is, then once you've given birth to that new batch and it's ready, it's still being checked for several months when you do the national laboratory testing. And is that really necessary? Or should we say that when the company does this, make sure that it is done right. And so that's an area there to save some. And the other thing is about the forecasting. We really, the earlier we know what the forecast is, the earlier we can start producing the batches. And otherwise it's guesswork. Otherwise it's guesswork. It really is.
And so one more comment that's really tied to this discussion is around investments, because companies need to make investments, the decisions about investments, very early on if they're thinking about ramping up manufacturing capacity. So if you add on to that sort of the manufacturing lead times, and you add that sort of investment decision making, you know, that needs to happen against other priorities, it's an even longer time period.
Yeah, now we're talking at least 5 years, because then you make that investment decision, you've got to build the facility, you're going to qualify, validate everything, and then produce that batch that takes 2 years. So we're talking at least 5 years if that happens. Yeah.
So it's not so much a human pregnancy or an elephant pregnancy, it's just going on. Anne, what were you going to say?
No, I guess that was actually my point, that it's not just about the regular lead times, which I think we are quite familiar with and which we do appreciate, and we do also understand that you cannot make shortcuts because we also don't want to compromise quality. But I think there is one plea that we have, and that's exactly with regards to the development timelines or supply expansion or capacity expansions. What are the indications that you're providing? As I keep ranting on the IPV example, because we're being met every day by countries that don't have access to the vaccine, and I think for us it's extremely important that whatever indication that we receive from you is really realistic, and that you're not overestimating how fast you'll actually make it to the market with a new vaccine, with an expansion of capacity, because that makes it extremely challenging for us to actually manage expectations with countries and partners. So that's just a plea, I think, from us to be very realistic. And I know timelines can slip, but...
I don't know where we're going here, but I mean, vaccines is also living systems, and therefore not everything goes exactly as you expect. And you can, again, with the statistics, if there's a 2% chance when you produce that something goes wrong, when you then have 7 or 8 different of these, where there's 2%, you can start, the write-off is actually quite big. The batches that are not going to make it all the way through is actually significant. And then there might be something happening. And then that might happen when you're on 15, 16 months, and then it's like, oh, this is a problem. So there's that factor in us as well. It's not that you just mix things and you know it's going to be good. There's usually it is, but there can be things happening, and that makes it worse, of course.
Back to that miracle.
Jules Milo, mine is from mine is a plea because I heard everybody saying we need to come together. Now, coming together, I look at the panel. Danish, where are you from? I mean, it's.
I'm from Denmark. I was going to say
okay.
that. It sounds like we're family. It's just that we're from Denmark.
Okay, so mostly Danish coming together. I mean, anyway, I look, and it's not the first time. We get in rooms, we all are Western here, and shortages are global, but the impacts are felt differently depending where you are on the globe. So as we are discussing solutions, sometimes it's good to have someone, at least one person, that is sort of telling from the perspective how it is felt when you are in Mali. It might not be exactly the same as when you are in Copenhagen. And for me, this is so important because I have my feet in both worlds. When there was no Ebola vaccine, the head of state of Guinea was stunned when he realized that there is some sort of thing that is called vaccine. But the experimental nature was lost in translation, and he couldn't just order to vaccinate his population. So the entire regulatory process was, I am the president, can't I just say, this is for my population, I can order to do it? And hearing that it's not possible was totally news. And so if we don't educate people as we go, whatever solution we come, and you are all experts, we are all very smart. I mean, sometimes I was wowed. But the solution sometimes it's blocked by some Minister of Health in Gambia that thinks that he is doing the right thing by introducing some small thing without realizing that it has impact in many ways. And the other thing is you had to have strong regulatory authorities. When there was meningitis epidemic in West Africa, some very clever pharmacists from my country managed to have 3 countries, some sort of manufacturing where maybe at the border between Niger and Nigeria, and brought something that he called vaccine. And he was selling in the country, making a lot of money. A former Minister of Health. And there was no regulatory authority to control what it was until we took one vial and just asked some chemist, a nurse, and it was water. But it took a while, and probably several people died before it was caught. So it's important that everybody is like working together and being part of the solution. Otherwise, we are going always to be a bit late or proposing solutions that look nice, expert-wise, but can be hitting the wall when it's spread around the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe to respond to you, at least on 2 items. Why we are all the white here, I think also because we're based in Geneva. So that also does help. I think from our side, if the meeting was taking place in Africa, for example, would certainly send our national association representative at the meeting there. When we discussed our recommendations, we had an extensive consultation with our national associations. So we present through our 139 national associations. A number of them are in Africa, in Asia, and around the world. So there's an element always for us of what is a relevance, not only for rich and wealthy country, but also for every country that we are represented into. The second element, I think your point around how does a shortage impact other items? And the element is, as you have a shortage or crisis of access to vaccines, it's open doors for unethical, quality questionable products. In the cases of Niger, there's several cases like this that has been aired. If you cannot find the products, you might look anywhere. And that is not a good option, but it's very human element. You say, if I cannot get what I know, sure, I will try to find an alternative, whether it's a counterfeit, whether it's substandard, whether it is anything. You might think that anything is still better than nothing, and it's not a good element. So I think for us, the shortage, we've seen a number of cases where shortage was an entry gate to counterfeit, or at least to very poor quality products. And that is a reflection on your points earlier.
You mentioned a lot of different things, I'd say. There's this cartoon that first picture is somebody says, who's for change? And everybody raises their hand. And then the next picture is who wants to change? And nobody raises their hand. And I think maybe that's something, change is always hardest for ourselves. It's very easy to talk about what everybody else should do. And I think everybody have to be a little balanced here. We shouldn't say it's all about others. It's also about others, but it's also about ourselves. So I'm the head of quality in Sanofi Pasteur. I'm aware of shortages everywhere in the world. We're a global company, and the shortage matters to me no matter where it is. It matters to the company no matter where it is. So I think we do not discriminate anywhere in the world. We want a world where no one suffers or dies of a vaccine-preventable disease. That's what we want. So I think that's really important to say, and I know that from many of my colleagues, they say the same thing. IFPMA has actually, in addition to take the initiative to this, actually took a lot of activity in relation to last year in November in Cape Town. There was the drug agencies or the regulatory agencies from around the world, the inspectorates, that got together and talked about drug shortages as well. And I was there in Cape Town, and it was a completely different audience than here. The topic was the same concerns. This is a global issue that needs a global solution. That's important to say.
There's a lady at the back. Please tell us who you are.
Sure, thank you. I'm Gina Saman from the WHO Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, so working in the flu world. My question is to Anders, mostly I think, about in pandemic influenza situations, what problems from your list go away and what new problems come up? Off the top of your head, what do you think?
So I will mention the solution first, and I think this is not only about this topic, but in general. People come together and find new ways of working when there's a problem. And we do find these solutions. So all of a sudden, I can live with this packaging configuration, or we can have a little bit different this or a little bit different that, and we avoid the crisis from being as big as it could have been. And I think that's what we need to think about when we work together to find solutions here. Could we take some of the things that works in a crisis situation and make them more the normal way of working together and finding solutions, and then get to the less complexity? It's always difficult when there's a pandemic, when all of a sudden the need goes up dramatically, how you can do that. It's not all vaccines that takes 2 years, but some take 2 years. The flu vaccines do not take 2 years. They're more simple to make. They're not simple, but they're simpler. And I think in that regards, I think we find the other. Somebody finds that stockpile somewhere, to Anne's point. Somebody says, "Hey, I actually have some here. You can use that." So I think if we could find ways of making what works in crisis situation a little bit more how we work in general, I think would be good. I don't know. Did you answer the question? Okay. Thank you.
Is there any one or two more, or shall we move to some closing remarks? Okay, great. Oh, one more.
So, Anders, thank you. You had mentioned earlier on that you think that the problem is actually escalating and not declining. Mm-hmm. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about why is it escalating? Is it truly escalating, or we're just talking about it some more? And if you think it's really escalating, I mean, why is that? Because we seem to be doing a whole lot more. We seem to be innovating much more, investing much more to, address the supply, issues. But yet we're seeing more evidence of supply shortages. Can you comment on that? I'm just interested in what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I cannot give the ultimate truth because it's complex. And I think we all come from a different angle and see it a little bit different, but I'll say how I see it. One is there is a consolidation in the vaccine world. There is a consolidation of number of global manufacturers. The way I see it is that when I started in this job 3 years ago, there was, I would say, about 6. Now there's about 4. This is an area where there's not more players entering, there are more players exiting from a manufacturing perspective. And then when you have fewer suppliers, then when there's a problem, as we talked about, you said before, when there's a problem, it cannot immediately be absorbed by us and say, oh yeah, we got other suppliers, I can just supply. So I think that's on the supply side, one of the reasons. I also think that in general, because of that regulatory complexity, that car might not be the newest, smartest car in average, because we do what we feel is absolutely necessary, but then the risk of something that breaks down is also higher. You will know that if you have an old car, it's more likely that it needs some repairs than if it's a brand new car. We are trying to invest all the time and so on, but it just takes a long time. If I want to change things now, it takes me 5 years, and then 5 years from now, that's not the technology, that's the latest and so on. So I think that is something as well. And then it's just being more and more well-educated and developed regulatory agencies around the world. We can see it also in inspections. There are agencies from countries that I, in my past, had never seen do a regulatory inspection in our facilities. We have almost constant inspections now from regulatory agencies around the world. There's very little mutual recognition. So we've seen the one with the US and Europe that's going to happen now, which is great. But so therefore, there's more and more questions, more and more things that makes it more complicated for us. So I think those are, for me, those are some of the elements. But I'm sure that Tania and Anne and Luc can add more to it because you see it from another angle as well. And I think one of the things that most people agree on now is the problem is getting worse. And we all have to do something about it. And we should not accept that in 2017, tetanus and diphtheria vaccines are not available. It should not be the case. It really should not be the case.
Let Tan.
Yes, John. So I don't think we. I mean, I would agree. I don't think we have an ultimate answer. I don't think we really have the data to say or I cannot quote to say it's increasing or decreasing. And the starting point of the problem is we don't have a definition. But if I think of it as stockouts, which is not shortages, so it's just as a proxy with it, a review of the data that was recently published for the data over the past 5 years shows that the number of stockouts had been decreasing and they went back up in 2015. So that's the only data that I can quote that we can make reference to that provides some numbers behind that. A thing that I like to raise when you mention diphtheria and tetanus, and to your question though, is also that things are fluid, right? So yes, diphtheria and tetanus have been there for a long time, but then there's combination vaccines that come along, and then there's different policy changes. So we are actually we're starting to look at diphtheria and tetanus, and we realize that we essentially, if we want to understand what's going on, we need to do an analysis of supply and demand dynamics for about 20 products. In between the different combinations and the fact that these ingredients are used for conjugation processes for some other products. So it's complex. And then as WHO, we continuously update our recommendations in terms of different schedules, for instance, for vaccines. And one of the recent updated position papers is on tetanus toxoids, requesting a higher number of, recommending a higher number of doses. And this has an impact on demand and will, unless, again, that dialogue we've been speaking about and that early warning and information is there, then that may have an impact on the ability of supply to meet demand. So I just think, we need to investigate farther where the issue is increasing in terms of concrete number of shortages going up or down and for which products. But I think we also need to accept that we won't have a solution that lasts forever because this is a fluid environment, and that again we need to keep an eye on this over time.
Right, Luc.
I think there's two elements there. One is, I think, especially in developed countries, we have better measurement. We measure better what is the situation. So then we start to have better figures around the shortages we are able to do. It's very incomplete because usually developing countries are less, access to the data is less easy to get. I think the second thing, and I don't have the figures only for the vaccines, but around the medicines in general. What we see that in a number of countries that are highly producing, primarily in Asia, the local demand in this country also increase at a higher rate than the increase of the production capacity. So you start to have tension on one hand of an increased demand, especially nationally, versus the capacity for them to continue to play the roles of providing medicines to other countries. So there's an element around how do we match that increased demand and the capacity to increase the capacity of production. That takes time, where at the same time you get increased facilities to facilitate access to medicines. That's great, but there's not always a very good coordination there. And the good example of Anne around vaccines that want to be introducing, but we know that there's not yet all the capacity to do so, is also a reflection of that tension that is available there.
I'm going to, sorry, we've kind of run out of time actually. I'm going to ask the panelists to just give us a take-home message each that you can summarize in about 30 seconds based on what we've spoken about, or just pick a highlight of today.
I can probably do it in 20 seconds. So I would say that this is a global problem that needs a global solution, number one. Forecasting needs to be better and complexity needs to go down.
Okay. Who'd like to take the next 30-second slot?
Happy to. I think we just want to recognize this is a problem. We'd like to understand better the extent of it and to do so help with the definition of the issue before we embark on solutions. But certainly on the solution side, we want to put an emphasis on collection, analysis, sharing of information and convening of different partners for a partnership solution around this.
Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, I think we all recognize that supply shortage is not going to go away. It's probably going to increase as we move forward, and I think we will need to have a continued close dialogue, all partners across the board to prevent, to be better at preventing, but also to cope when the situation is occurring. So be prepared for those situations, better than we've been in the past, I think, will be critical.
Thank you. Luke?
I think also the situation about shortages is also a reflection of the complexity of the pharmaceutical sector and the pharmaceutical supply chain production and everything. As we increase that complexity, we have more intermediate and everything. That also leads to sometimes also some of extra reason for that. So, some of the reasons that we mentioned earlier are directly connected to that complexity and to the way the system is currently being structured. And the second piece is an engagement with all stakeholders, in addition to the industry, to the procurement agencies, or to intergovernmental organization. I think you need to involve the patient, you need to involve healthcare professionals, including pharmacists, and you need to involve really those who are all involved and could be impacted by any shortage of vaccines.
Thank you. Guys, thank you so much for coming. It's been fascinating. And thank you very much to the IFPMA for inviting us here. Thank you to Sarah. Please go and see her afterwards.